The Royal Australian Navy, who is subordinate to the Chief of the Defence Force who commands the ADF. The current CN is Vice Admiral Michael Noonan. The CN is also directly responsible to the Minister of Defence, with the Department of Defence administering the ADF and the Navy. Formed in 1901 as the Commonwealth Naval Forces, through the amalgamation of the Australian colonial navies following Federation, it was granted its current title in 1911. Originally intended for local defence, it became increasingly responsible for the defence of the region as the United Kingdom started to diminish its forces in the Pacific. The Royal Navy's Australian Squadron, which was assigned to the Australia Station, provided support to the RAN until naval ships purchased from Britain arrived. The Australian and New Zealand governments helped to fund the Australian Squadron until 1913, while the Admiralty committed itself to keeping the squadron at a constant strength. The Australian Squadron ceased on 4 October 1913, when RAN ships entered Sydney Harbour for the first time. The Royal Navy continued to provide blue water defence capability in the Pacific up to the early years of the Second World War. Then, rapid wartime expansion saw the acquisition of large surface vessels and the building of many smaller warships. In the decade following the war, the RAN acquired a small number of aircraft carriers, the last of which was decommissioned in 1982. Today, the RAN consists of 46 commissioned vessels, 3 non-commissioned vessels and over 16,000 personnel. The Navy is one of the largest and most sophisticated naval forces in the South Pacific region, with a significant presence in the Indian Ocean and worldwide operations in support of military campaigns and peacekeeping missions. The Commonwealth Naval Forces were established on 1 March 1901. With the amalgamation of the 6 separate colonial naval forces, following the Federation of Australia, the Royal Australian Navy initially consisted of the former New South Wales, Victorian, Queensland, Western Australian, South Australian and Tasmanian ships and resources of their disbanded navies. The Defence Act of 1903 established the operation and command structure of the Royal Australian Navy. When policymakers sought to determine the newly established force's requirements and purpose, a period of uncertainty followed, with the debate focusing upon whether Australia's naval force would be structured mainly for local defence or designed to serve as a fleet unit within a larger imperial force, controlled centrally by the British Admiralty. In 1908-09, the decision was made to pursue a compromise solution, and the Australian government agreed to establish a force that would be used for local defence but which would be capable of forming a fleet unit within the imperial naval strategy, albeit without central control. As a result, the Navy's force structure was set at 1 battlecruiser, 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers and 3 submarines. The first of the RAN's new vessels, the destroyer Yarra, was completed in September 1910, and by the outbreak of the First World War the majority of the planned fleet had been realized. On 10 July 1911, King George V granted the service the title of Royal Australian Navy. Following the declaration of war on the Central Powers, the British War Office requested the Australian government to deal with Pacific German colonies. Additionally, German merchant shipping in the Pacific was disrupted by the RAN's capture of their vessels. The Australian squadron was placed under control of the British Admiralty, and initially it was tasked with capturing many of Germany's South Pacific colonies and protecting Australian shipping from the German East Asia Squadron. Later in the war, most of the RAN's major ships operated as part of Royal Navy forces in the Mediterranean and North Seas, and then later in the Adriatic, and then the Black Sea following the surrender of the Ottoman Empire. In 1919, the RAN received a force of 6 destroyers, 3 sloops and 6 submarines from the Royal Navy. But throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the RAN was drastically reduced in size due to a variety of factors including political apathy and economic hardship as a result of the Great Depression. In this time the focus of Australia's naval policy shifted from defence against invasion to trade protection. and several fleet units were sunk as targets or scrapped. By 1923, the size of the Navy had fallen to 8 vessels, and by the end of the decade it had fallen further to 5, with just 3,500 personnel. In the late 1930s, as international tensions increased, the RAN was modernized and expanded, with the service receiving primacy of funding over the Army and Air Force during this time as Australia began to prepare for war. Early in the Second World War, RAN ships again operated as part of Royal Navy formations, many serving with distinction in the Mediterranean. The R.